You were never supposed to hear this. Not in this life, not in any life. What I am about to tell you was buried under ash, locked in silence, and whispered only in the fevered breaths of men who knew their souls were already damned. Close your eyes for just a second and imagine a South Carolina plantation in 1841. Oh. The cypress trees hanging heavy like executioners waiting for the rope to drop. The house whitewashed on the outside but rotting inside with secrets belonged to a man who called himself Silas, Ruddled. But names are lies, masks for darker truths. Silas was not just a planter of rice. He was a planter of terror. A man bound to an ancient brotherhood that demanded not faith, not prayer, but sacrifice. And his sacrifice was his own bloodline, his daughter. Picture her, Catherine, 28 years old, flesh swollen from mercury treatments that were less medicine and more chains forged in her veins. They called her hysterical. They called her insane. But that was the mask. The reality? She had seen what she was never meant to see. At 12 years old, she stumbled into the cellar beneath Cypress Grove and watched as 13 men, her father among them, spilled blood into the soil to strengthen the land. They told her it was a dream. They drugged her, silenced her, broke her down year after year. But madness is sometimes nothing more than clarity in a world built on lies. This is where the descent begins. Silas received a letter sealed in red wax, marked with a scythe crossed with wheat, the insignia of the Brethren of the Harvest. They told him his debts could be erased, his status restored. All he had to do was surrender his daughter, not to doctors, not to God, but to a man, society said, was beneath even animals, an enslaved carpenter named Ezekiel. But Ezekiel was not what he appeared to be. He carried within him the patience of vengeance, the rage of a husband who had buried his family in shallow, unmarked graves, and the knowledge of herbs and poisons passed down through generations. He was not chosen by chance. He was placed, like a piece on a board, to play a role in a ritual that would consume everyone who touched it. What happened next was never written in any history book. The plantations burned. Men with names carved into courthouse stone were found gutted like livestock. In Catherine's body, her very flesh became something that terrified even the brethren themselves. This is not just a story. This is a warning. Because when you see how far they will go to keep power, you'll begin to ask the one question they fear most. If they could do this then, what are they doing now? They came for Ezekiel with deliberate hands, not by accident, but by design, a transfer arranged in letters and ledger entries, in whispers across back porches, and in the quiet nods exchanged at county gatherings. Imagine him stepping down from a trader's wagon, boots caked with road dust, eyes steady as a man who has learned the language of patience. He was introduced as a carpenter, a healer, a quiet and obedient worker. Those were convenient lies. The truth fit into no neat description. Ezekiel carried memory like a tool belt name stitched into a scrap of cloth. A map of betrayals, a slow-burning calculus of justice. When he looked at Silas, Ruddled, he did not see a master. He saw a signature, a node in a network that had cost him everything. He saw where the blame could be placed, and he carried the patience to wait until the pattern made itself useful. Inside Cypress Grove, the house performed the age-old ritual of polite cruelty. Linen and chandeliers over a foundation of routine violence. People who dined by candlelight slept on consciences softened by etiquette. The cellar, the real heart of their strength, was a shadow economy where agriculture met invocation, where superstition had been taught the grammar of power. The Brethren of the Harvest were not mere farmers nostalgic for old ways. They were an institutional current that flowed beneath polite society, and its currency was submission. They taught men how to translate fear into yield, how to make the land obedient by convincing themselves that what fed them required blood. Ezekiel arrived already inside a strategy. He watched patterns, who lit the lamps late, who locked their doors early, which voices stopped when certain names were spoken. He listened to the plantation's gossip, like it was the wind reading the map for him. He learned where the brethren gathered, which candles they favored, what folk remedies were really codes. He was patient because patience was a kind of armor. He could not simply stab through a house of rot. He had to erode it from within to make the rot visible, undeniable. His tools would be rites of care disguised as medicine, conversations that palpated memory until the truth rose like a fever. He would not be the instrument of chaos for its own sake. He would be the vector through which buried truth surfaced and turned the community's confidence into panic. Silas, drunk on avoidance, thought himself the architect of a masterstroke. By surrendering Catherine, he preserved his outward life. He believed social ritual would absorb the shame. He imagined the brethren's support as a cloak. But he misread a fundamental currency. Men who build empires on silence rarely anticipate the price when silence is broken. Catherine, for all her supposed fragility, had a witness inside her images and names that would not be smoothed out by opiates and excuses. Ezekiel knew how to speak to those witnesses. He would not just tend her body. He would tend the memory lodged within, and from that slow tending, the first fissures would form small at first, then widening until the structure that had seemed immovable began to answer in tremors. The slow work of undoing a house begins with language. Not the grand speeches in courtrooms, but the small recalibrations of how people speak to one another. Ezekiel knew this. He understood that power doesn't fall with a single blade. It falls when stories change, when the grammar of a community no longer supports silence. So he began to rename the ordinary things, the medicines that kept Catherine dull as chains. The late-night banquets where the brethren resurfaced as rituals, the polite euphemisms of the county as what they were masks. Each renamed thing was a chisel against the edifice of consent. Each conversation he coaxed from Catherine was a seed planted in a field of complacency that had been taught to accept its wounds as normal. He used the rituals of care as camouflage. A warmed compress on a fevered brow, a measured tincture, a walk down a hallway, simple acts that lowered guard and pulled memory from hiding. But every act of care was also an interrogation dressed as kindness. He asked questions that sounded like concern, but were designed to pry open the locked corners of memory. He made room for Catherine's voice to reassemble itself. It's not as the ramblings of a mad woman, but as testimony shaped by precision and purpose. When memory returned, it did not come as a tidy narrative. It arrived jagged, in flashes, in smells and sounds, and the weight of a hand on a plank of wood. Ezekiel cataloged it all with the sobriety of a man mapping a route through enemy territory names. It was the syllables of a chant. Each detail was a lever. Outside the house, the brethren continued their performance, lawyers and ministers, smiling at one another across mahogany, and yet cracks began to appear in their choreography. A servant overheard a phrase and misremembered it into a rumor. A merchant noticed an odd purchase and followed a trail of receipts. Humans are porous. Secrets leak at the seams. Ezekiel had no need for spectacles of violence at first. He needed the slow, corrosive work of exposure. He set small traps, a misplaced note left where a curious hand would find it. A whispered contradiction allowed to reach a confidant who loved scandal. The social currency of the county turned on reputation. Once reputation frayed, authority bled. And still, the brethren held advantages, laws they'd shaped. Judges who owed favors, ministers who preached obedience as divine. Their power was institutional, burying dissent beneath precedent, paperwork, and ritual. Ezekiel's threat was not merely to confront men with truth, but to transform truth into proof. He would not simply shout into the dark. He would light it, room by room, so witnesses could see with their own eyes. That was the real danger to men who built empires on quiet. Once light travels enough corridors, structure cannot hide the rot any longer. The question was not whether the brethren would respond, they would. But how many would survive the exposure when the town's comfortable story unraveled into evidence and accusation? The first sign that Catherine was changing came in her silence. Not the drugged silence her father bought with laudanum, but a quiet charged with intent. Her eyes, once clouded by Mercury's fog, began to sharpen. and she watched Ezekiel with a curiosity that unsettled him. She wanted to know why he had risked so much to sit in that room with her, why his gaze never wavered when she trembled through nights of fever. He did not tell her everything. Vengeance does not survive when it's shouted too early. Instead, he gave her pieces of truth here, a doubt there, until she began stitching her own pattern. And what she made was darker than even Ezekiel imagined. Not just survival, but revenge as architecture. Catherine carried her memories like fragments of broken glass. At 12, she had descended into the cellar, chasing the sound of laughter. What she found were men in robes of black faces half-shadowed, standing around a table marked with symbols she could not then understand. A lamb bled out onto the stone, its cries echoing like a child's. And then, not a lamb. She never said whose blood followed, only that the smell haunted her until she vomited bile for days. Her father told her it was a dream. Doctors told her it was hysteria. Neighbors told her she was cursed. But in Ezekiel's steady presence, she began to realize that all of them had been performing the same act, protecting the secret at the cost of her sanity. With each day off the poisons, her speech grew less erratic. She started asking questions. What did Ezekiel know of the brethren? How many names did he carry in his head? And more dangerously, how many allies could they find? Ezekiel had expected a fragile patient, but what he discovered was a co-conspirator. Beneath years of sedation was a mind sharper than most men's, a rage honed into clarity. Catherine no longer wanted freedom in the way people whispered about it. She wanted fire, public disgrace, annihilation of the order that had imprisoned her. This was the turning point. Ezekiel had entered the house with the patience of a carpenter, planning to dismantle beams one by one. Catherine offered him dynamite. Together, they began to shape a pact, hers born of humiliation and trauma, his of grief and calculation. Two wounded bodies, aligning not for healing, but for retribution. And in that alignment, the first tremors began to move through Cypress Grove. Subtle enough that the brethren mistook them for ordinary unrest. But rot, once disturbed, spreads faster than those who feast upon it can imagine. The house was no longer theirs alone. It was becoming a battlefield disguised as a sick room. The first plan was not spoken aloud. It began with gestures, with the careful exchange of looks in rooms where silence had been Catherine's prison. Ezekiel, sharpening a chisel by the window. Catherine, her hand pausing above a page of her father's ledgers. They had discovered one another's intent not through declarations but through recognition. Two people wounded by the same hand, waiting for the same opportunity. Catherine's advantage was subtle but lethal. She had been dismissed so long as the madwoman, that no one noticed what she noticed. In her father's study, she saw receipts for livestock that never arrived. Crates delivered in the dead of night, bottles labeled quinine but sealed with a different wax. She remembered which guests her father greeted with handshakes too long, which names always surfaced in whispers after dinner. She had been gaslit into believing these fragments were illusions, but now she had Ezekiel to confirm them. Each scrap of memory became a piece of evidence, and Ezekiel treated them like a craftsman setting boards into a larger frame. He, too, had begun to move in shadows. By day, he repaired broken shutters, mended chairs, shaped wood into usefulness. By night, he walked the edges of the property, memorizing the paths to the root cellar. The layout of the gathering hall, the timing of the night guards. He knew how to vanish into the dark, how to make himself invisible until he chose otherwise. And in those hours, he was not simply a carpenter, he was a strategist, rehearsing the dismantling of an empire. Their first act of rebellion was deceptively small. Catherine, feigning compliance, began saving doses of her prescribed mercury and laudanum, slipping them into the fireplace ashes or pressing them into the dirt of her garden. When the fog lifted fully, she could think in straight lines. Ezekiel supplied her with bitter teas that disguised their true purpose, strengthening the body, sharpening the senses, purging the poisons. Slowly, the madwoman began to return as someone her father did not recognize, someone he had spent years trying to erase. But strategy requires more than recovery. It requires timing. Catherine insisted they could not strike, only at her father. That would leave the brethren intact, and vengeance half-finished was more dangerous than vengeance unbegun. Ezekiel agreed. The plan would need to touch not just Silas Ruddled, but the network he served: the lawyers, the ministers, the merchants who laughed over secrets. To collapse a house so fortified they could not pull one beam, they had to make the entire foundation tremble. So they began their ritual. Catherine recording names and dates from memory, Ezekiel mapping paths and weaknesses, both of them weaving to lives into one dangerous fabric. They knew discovery meant death, public, brutal, final. But as Catherine whispered one night, her voice steady and fierce, better to die exposing them than live as their shadow. Ezekiel did not answer, but the silence between them was agreement. And so, a pact became a plan. The plantation, once a monument to control, now held within it a hidden conspiracy. Neither Catherine nor Ezekiel yet understood how far the brethren's roots reached. But already, the first seeds of collapse had been sown. The first strike was not a blaze of violence, but a whisper designed to spread like smoke. Ezekiel understood that panic is most powerful when it begins in silence, when no one can trace its origin. Catherine agreed. Together, they decided the first act would not be to kill, but to fracture belief, the invisible glue holding the brethren's confidence together. It began with a name. Catherine remembered the ledger her father locked away, the one with debts recorded not in dollars but in symbol circles, crosses, and a crude scythe scratched beside certain entries. She recognized one name repeated often: Judge Harlan, a man revered for his sermons on order and law. Ezekiel took that name and carved it quietly into the beam of the slave quarters, small enough that only those who knew the sigil of the brethren would understand. Days later, a whisper spread among the field workers. The judge was marked. Nobody knew who carved it. Nobody dared say it aloud. But unease began to ripple, and unease was the beginning of erosion. The second blow was Catherine's. At supper, she feigned a daze, letting a memory slip in front of guests. She spoke of the night she heard chanting in the cellar, the smell of blood, the faces that stared too long into the fire. Her father silenced her with a shout, calling her hysterical. But not before two merchants exchanged glances across the table. They had heard too much, and in their eyes flickered a question they dared not voice. What if her madness was truth? In a community where reputation was currency, a seed of doubt could bankrupt a man faster than any debt. The brethren felt it. At their next gathering in the cellar, Silas demanded order, but Ezekiel had already visited the space. He left behind no footprints, no broken locks, only a single candle melted into the shape of a cross, inverted and broken at the base. When the brethren entered, their ritual halted. No one admitted fear, but every man felt the chill of intrusion. They argued in hushed voices, each accusing the other of carelessness. Trust, essential for men who trafficked in secrets, began to corrode. For the first time, Catherine and Ezekiel watched the brethren stumble. A network that had stood for decades now flinched at shadows. Silas tried to reassure them, insisting control remained in his grasp. But in private, he doubled her dosage, forced her to her room, and interrogated Ezekiel with suspicion disguised as politeness. It did not matter. The cracks had formed. What Catherine and Ezekiel both knew was this: terror works both ways. The brethren had built their empire by weaponizing fear. Now, for the first time, that weapon had been turned inward, and fear, once seeded, grows wild. The brethren were not men accustomed to doubt. They had built their power on the illusion of certainty that they alone knew the order of the world, that others bowed because they controlled the strings. But after the cellar incident, after Catherine's mutterings at the dinner table, after the mark carved into the beams, doubt spread among them like rot in the foundation of a house. Judge Harlan was the first to react. He summoned Silas to his chambers under the pretense of legal counsel. In reality, he demanded answers. Who is speaking? Who has seen too much? Silas, pale with shame, swore Catherine was mad and Ezekiel was harmless. But Harlan leaned close, voice cold as iron. If your daughter's tongue endangers us, you will silence her one way or another. That command was not suggestion, it was law within their circle. Silas left shaken, torn between his ambition and the one sliver of paternal duty left inside him. The retaliation began quietly. Catherine noticed the meals brought to her room tasted bitter, the broth laced with something that burned her throat. Ezekiel recognized it at once, belladonna disguised in small doses. Not enough to kill her immediately, but enough to erode her senses, to drag her back into fog. He smashed the bowls against the wall, vowing she would eat nothing unless he prepared it himself. Catherine, trembling but defiant, whispered, "They are afraid. That means we are winning. But fear makes men reckless." One night, Ezekiel returned to his cabin to find his cloth bundle disturb the one that carried the names of his wife and children. The paper was gone. In its place lay a bone fragment, etched with the same sigil of the scythe. The brethren were warning him, "We see you. We can take everything from you again." For hours, Ezekiel sat in the dark, fists clenched, rage threatening to consume reason. Catherine found him there and said only one sentence that anchored him. "If you break now, their chains remain unbroken forever." Still, the brethren's counterattack intensified. Silas doubled Ezekiel's labor, assigning him endless tasks in the fields by day, forcing exhaustion to weaken his resolve. Overseers watched him with cruel smiles, waiting for any excuse to whip him. At night, riders circled the cabins, their torches glowing like hunting eyes. The message was clear. We are watching. We are hunting. You belong to us. But here lay their miscalculation. Ezekiel did not break. Instead, he used the pressure as a whetstone, sharpening his resolve into something deadly. Catherine, too, now clearer of mind, began recording everything she remembered: the names, the rituals, the locations. On scraps of stolen parchment, she wrote the confessions of the brethren in her own hand, planning to unleash them at the right moment. The brethren thought they were tightening the noose. What they did not realize was that every attempt to crush Catherine and Ezekiel only forged them into something far more dangerous, not victims. Not fugitives, but conspirators who now understood the full depth of their enemy's desperation. And desperate men, once cornered, always bleed. The first strike had to be precise. Not rage-driven, not reckless surgical. Ezekiel knew that revenge, if rushed, becomes just another act of desperation. But a single, well-placed cut could unravel the entire weave of power the brethren had wrapped around Cypress Grove. Catherine agreed. She said it best, "We cannot shout against them. We must whisper in the right ear until the whole house crumbles." Their chosen target was Reverend Crenshaw, the sanctimonious viper who preached obedience by day and drank blood by candlelight at night. Unlike the judge or the planters, Crenshaw lacked wealth. His power was belief. He ruled the county's minds from the pulpit, convincing enslaved and free alike that God had blessed the chains on their wrists. If Crenshaw fell, the brethren's illusion of divine sanction would fracture, and men stripped of their myth grow weaker than anyone. The plan unfolded beneath layers of ordinary routine. Ezekiel used his access to the fields and kitchens to move unnoticed. He gathered herbs, powders, and roots from the land's substances his grandmother once said could cloud the mind, distort memory, bend the will of the unwary. Catherine, in her room, copied passages from Crenshaw's own sermons onto scraps of paper, altering a word here, twisting a phrase there. The result was blasphemy disguised as his own handwriting. They would turn his weapon faith against him. The opportunity came at a Sunday gathering, the chapel overflowing with enslaved workers forced to attend. Crenshaw stood at the pulpit, booming about order, obedience, sacrifice. But as he spoke, his hand trembled. He wiped sweat from his brow, though the air was cool. His cup of water, replaced that morning by Ezekiel's mixture, burned his throat and clouded his mind. His voice faltered, words slipping from memory. Then, as if compelled by some invisible force, he pulled a folded page from his pocket, the false sermon Catherine had planted. He read it aloud without realizing his tongue betraying him. The strong must feed on the weak. God commands the spilling of blood. The harvest thrives when bodies are broken. Gasps filled the chapel. Murmurs rose. Enslaved men and women looked at one another, realizing they had just heard the Reverend confess the very horrors whispered about the brethren. By the time Crenshaw stumbled from the pulpit, pale and shaking, the damage was done. Rumors spread like wildfire. The man of God had spoken words no God could bless. Doubt was seated not just among the enslaved, but among the white families who relied on Crenshaw to sanctify their cruelty. Within a week, his congregation shrank. Within a month, whispers of devilry attached to his name. Silas heard it. The judge heard it. Every member of the brethren heard it. They knew this was no accident. Someone inside their walls was moving against them. And for the first time in years, the brethren felt what they had made others feel. Paranoia. The brethren answered Crenshaw's humiliation with teeth bared. Power that once moved in shadows now lashed out in daylight. Within days, Cypress Grove became a fortress of cruelty. Overseers carried whips not as symbols, but as promises, and they used them for the smallest defiance. The cabins of the enslaved were searched, torn apart, families dragged into the yard and questioned beneath torchlight. The message was clear. Someone among you has struck us, and you will all bleed until the guilty reveal themselves. But fear only works when people feel alone. Catherine, from her upstairs chamber, listened to the screams at night and wrote down every atrocity. Ezekiel, though watched like a hawk, began moving carefully between cabins, whispering to those he trusted, "They are not gods. They can bleed. You have seen it." For the first time, whispers of resistance spread like sparks across dry grass. The brethren thought they were tightening their grip. They were, without knowing, creating the tinder for an inferno. Then came their most violent retaliation. One moonless night, the judge himself ordered a lesson. 5 enslaved men were taken from their beds and brought to the great oak near the fields. No charges, no words, just ropes, torches, and fire. Their bodies were left hanging, swaying in silence as dawn rose, a grotesque warning to anyone thinking of rebellion. Silas stood there, face grim, pretending it was justice. But inside, even he felt the tremor of what they had unleashed. For cruelty that naked rarely stays contained. Ezekiel saw the bodies at sunrise, and something inside him snapped into clarity. This was no longer only about revenge. This was about ending a cycle of control that had lasted generations. Catherine, too, stared from her window with a look that was not shock, not grief, but fury sharpened to a blade. "They want us to fear the rope," she whispered when Ezekiel entered her room that evening. "Then let us turn the rope into their noose." Together, they mapped their next strike. No more whispers, no more indirect sabotage. The brethren had drawn blood in the open, so the response would also bleed. Catherine revealed something she had never told before, that beneath Cypress Grove's cellar, deeper than the ritual chamber, there was a hidden crypt. It was where the brethren stored their records, their oaths, the names of those who paid for silence. If that crypt was exposed, the entire society of Colleton County would crumble. But to reach it meant war. The crypt was guarded not only by locks and chains, but by men who would kill without hesitation. Catherine smiled at the thought. "Then let them try," she said, voice cold as stone. "We have already chosen death. That makes us untouchable." And so the retaliation that was meant to break them became the spark of their boldest plan yet. The brethren had spilled blood to remind the world of their power. Catherine and Ezekiel would answer by pulling their secrets into the light and burying them in it. The night chosen for the descent was drenched in storm. Thunder rolled like the voice of an ancient judge, and rain lashed against the shutters as if the heavens themselves wished to wash away. Cypress Grove. Ezekiel carried only a lantern and a length of iron he had shaped into a pry bar. Catherine, pale but unshakable, clutched her parchment pages to her chest, the confessions, the names, the truths that could turn whispers into a weapon sharper than any blade. They moved in silence through the hallways. Silas lay drunk in his study, his head collapsed against a table of spilled brandy. The house servants kept their eyes down, but some glanced with flickers of knowing they had seen the change in Catherine's eyes, the purpose in Ezekiel's step. In the storm's roar, they slipped into the cellar. What lay beneath was worse than rumor. The walls were lined with shelves of bone relics, chalices stained dark, and ledgers bound in leather too supple to human. Sigils were carved into the stone, the same harvest scythe etched again and again. And in the center, chained to a pillar, was the ledger of the brethren. Names, dates, debts, sacrifices recorded in ink. A record not of faith, but of rot. Catherine's hands shook as she opened it. Every judge, every merchant, every reverend who had smiled from a pulpit or a courthouse was listed here. Each man bought and bound by the same blood oath. This, she whispered, is their empire. Ezekiel struck the lock with his iron until it snapped. He handed her the book. Then let us end it. But the brethren had not been blind. The storm masked footsteps descending behind them. Torches flared. Judge Harlan, Reverend Crenshaw, and 3 others stood at the archway, eyes blazing with fury. Silas stumbled behind them, face pale, torn between terror and loyalty. "You dare," Harlan hissed. "You dare defile the covenant." Catherine stepped forward, the ledger raised like scripture. "Covenant?" Her voice cut like thunder. "You call this covenant? This is rot. This is filth. You have built your power on lies and corpses. Tonight, the corpses speak." Crenshaw snarled, lunging, but Ezekiel met him with the iron bar. Bone cracked. The reverend collapsed in the filth he had sanctified. The others faltered, their arrogance colliding with fear. Catherine hurled the ledger into the fire pit. Flames roared, devouring their secrets as fast as rain soaked the earth above. The brethren shouted, clawing toward it, but it was too late. Their empire of silence turned to ash before their eyes. Silas fell to his knees, weeping not for his daughter, not for the innocents, but for the crumbling of the only power he had ever worshipped. Catherine looked at him with neither love nor hatred, only judgment. "You gave me to them," she said, voice steady. "Now, I return you to the fire you served." Ezekiel pulled her close as the storm broke through the roof, lightning splitting the beams. The crypt collapsed, burying the brethren in the very tomb they had built for others. When dawn came, Cypress Grove was nothing but ruined, smoldering timber, shattered stone, and silence. But in that silence, something new stirred. The enslaved stood at the edges of the wreckage, not bowed, not weeping, but waiting. Catherine and Ezekiel emerged from the smoke, scarred but unbroken. Catherine lifted her hand, ash streaking her face like war paint, and said only 2 words: "Never again." That phrase spread from mouth to mouth, from cabin to field, until it carried beyond the plantation into the county, then beyond the county into legend. Men who heard it felt something crack inside the illusion of control, the chains of fear. And you, listening now, are not here by accident. You were meant to hear this forbidden history. You were meant to know what they hide, what they build, what they destroy, and how it can all be burned down with truth and fire. If you have followed me this far, then mark yourself as one who sees through the veil. Comment these words twice below to lock them in your mind. To let the algorithm of fate itself know you are awake. The chains are ash. Say it twice. The chains are ash. The chains are ash. And remember, once you speak them, you cannot return to ignorance. You are no longer a bystander in history. You are part of its reckoning.